The committee will come to order. Wildfires are an increasing threat to our country. They have gotten bigger, they have burned more land and put more communities in danger. Last year alone, wildfires affected Americans from Hawaii to the Great Smoky Mountains. And this year, they're likely to get worse. As we sit here today, communities in Texas just recently finished fighting the largest wildfire in the history of that state. It burned almost 1.4 million acres of land, taking lives, damaging houses, devastating agriculture, displacing families, and leaving property across the northern edge of the state in ruin. Last August fire in Maui was absolutely catastrophic and even more deadly. It took the lives of over 100 people and shattered countless communities. It was the deadliest wildfire in our country in over a century. The Council of Native American Advancement and the Mayor of Maui County have submitted written testimony regarding the ongoing recovery efforts in Maui, and I move to offer them into the hearing record without objection. These are just a few of the examples of a new crisis, one that's putting even more Americans at risk. The effects of these fires aren't only physical danger and property damage, they also bring a host of health risks to our communities, even in locations hundreds of miles from the fire. Last year, large swaths of the eastern United States were impacted by wildfire smoke from Canada, causing unhealthy air quality from Detroit to Washington, D.C. to Boston. Inhaling such smoke causes lung disease, heart problems, as well as cancer. As wildfires grow more common in urban communities, they can burn dangerous synthetic materials. Even after the fire is over, the threat remains. After effects like floods, mudslides, and barren land can threaten public safety for years. But it doesn't stop there. Wildfires are also unbelievably expensive. They amount to billions of dollars in response and recovery costs, as well as economic losses every single year. Our state and local governments have to spend already limited resources onto these disasters, often much more than they can afford. Businesses lose money, properties lose value, infrastructure gets damaged, and industries are changed for good. This isn't just a land management issue anymore. It's also an emerging crisis of public health, emergency management, and economic security. That's partly due to development. We're building more in the, quote, wild land urban interface, a term for the transitional zone between unoccupied land and settled property. And that brings us closer to wildfires that in the past could have been contained within uninhabited land. This problem is also exacerbated by climate change. We have higher temperatures, more droughts, and a host of other ecological factors that make wildfires more dangerous. They are one of the gravest consequences of global climate change. In short, this is a serious problem. Climate change is making it worse, and we have to improve our response, our recovery, and mitigation efforts. We have a few key tools for that work. FEMA is the government agency tasked with disaster relief, and wildfires affecting communities falls under their purview. FEMA handles declarations and gives out key resources to communities affected by wildfires. But the increasing danger posed by wildfires has revealed gaps in this agency's infrastructure. For instance, many of its programs were designed for other hazards like floods and hurricanes and do not adequately meet the needs of wildfires. So I look forward to hearing from our panel of witnesses on what FEMA needs to do in order to properly mitigate this threat. Our witnesses will also provide valuable insight on the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission. The commission, which I want to thank Senator Romney for championing, was marked up in this committee and signed into law as part of the bipartisan infrastructure law. It offered a sweeping review of our government's response to wildfires and what we need to improve. It was co-chaired by FEMA, the Department of Agriculture, and the Department of Interior, and released nearly 150 recommendations this past September. The report outlined ways we can expand our workforce to fight fires, modernize the tools we use, invest in resilient infrastructure, and adopt a proactive approach so that our communities can be better prepared to face this problem in the future. Our committee has taken some key steps related to the report's recommendation. Last year, the Senate passed my Bipartisan Disaster Assistance Simplification Act, which makes it easier for people to get help they need after wildfires, as well as other serious natural disasters. This Congress, the Senate passed the Fire Grants and Safety Act, which will help expand our workforce and support firefighters all across America. This committee has also passed the Wildland Firefighter Paycheck Protection Act, led by Senator Sinema, to establish a permanent, updated pay scale for federal firefighters. We will continue working to advance this bipartisan legislation through Congress to prevent a pay cliff for wildland firefighters at the end of this fiscal year. But there's still so much more we need to do. Wildfires have become a crisis for our country and one that calls for bold and comprehensive solutions. This threat isn't just going to go away, and this committee must play a central role in our federal government's response. So today's discussion with our expert witnesses represent a meaningful step towards that goal. I would now like to invite Senator Romney to share some opening remarks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing. This is a national priority. It is tragic that we continue to have wildfires of the nature we have. Some have become conflagrations. There's been massive loss of life, and this is a problem from Hawaii to Canada to the southern border, across the country, and more states are being affected by wildfires. It's not just a few states in the American West, as we sometimes think is the case. It is a national concern. I particularly want to thank Utah's Director of Forestry, Jamie Barnes, for being here and being willing to share her expertise with this committee. We have some 800 to 1,000 wildfires per year just in Utah. And when you think about the impact of these fires, I go back to 2018, we had one called the Dollar Ridge Fire, and what was most unusual about that is that it dramatically impacted the watershed going into rivers and streams and lakes, killed wildlife, fish, threatened the drinking supply of people in Panguitch, Utah. So the challenge is not just that we're putting CO2 and smoke in the air and threatening structures and life, but we're also affecting our drinking water and the life of wildlife. In 2021, the Parley's Canyon fire forced the evacuation of 8,000 residents along the Wasatch Front for an extended period of time. And I went and met with people there, and they were angry, asking why couldn't we do a better job preventing these things from happening? I didn't have a lot of answers. We were actually even considering closing down Interstate 80 as a result of that fire. So back in 2021, Senator Mark Kelly of Arizona and I introduced the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission Act. It put together, as you know, some 50 individuals, federal, state, local, private sector, public sector, FEMA. This group came together. They have put together a report as of September of last year with some 148 different recommendations. And Senator Kelly and I are working on legislation to take these recommendations and turn them into law. That's one of the reasons we wanted to have this hearing today, to get your perspectives on what things we might want to turn into law. I appreciate very much the work that you're doing. It is a national priority. I recognize that we can't keep on doing the way we have in the past. We're going to have some changes. It's going to require additional funding. We may need additional fixed-wing aircraft, different monitoring systems, different remediation, different forestry management, different prescribed burns processes. There are a lot of things that we are going to have to do differently than we have in the past. So I look forward to the testimony today, particularly from Director Barnes and the rest of you, and appreciate the willingness of members of our committee to come together and to focus on this important issue. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Romney. I'd now like to invite Senator Langford to share some opening remarks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Sometimes when people think about wildfires, they don't think about Oklahoma. They think about some of the areas of tall timber. I do want to remind folks, we do have tall timber in Oklahoma as well on the eastern side of our state, and we have great areas of prairie grass on the west. February the 26th, just a few weeks ago, wildfires broke out in the state of Oklahoma, and according to our forestry services, we had 152,000 acres that were burned. Just in February 26th and the days that are following that, we had a high fire danger day even yesterday, as that is continuing to be able to come. Just in that fire on February 26th and the time after that, we had 19 homes destroyed. We had 4 injuries that were there, a lot of livestock and a lot of fence line through that area. Our neighbors in Texas, where one of the fires actually started and moved into the Panhandle of Oklahoma, lost over 1 million acres just at the end of February and early in March. This is wildfire season in Oklahoma. It's when we see a lot of the fires actually take off quickly with the dry vegetation and high winds coming through. That's why Senator Brasso, Senator Manchin, we're holding hearings on wildfires as well this week as we continue to be able to talk through the other issues that we can to try to resolve as many things as we can. We do have to address areas of mitigation. That's grazing, that's prescribed burns, that's timber harvesting, that's removal of hazardous fuels. And the hazardous fuels for us in Oklahoma is actually the red cedar, which actually just explodes when fire gets near them as well. So it is a big issue for us. It is an invasive tree. It takes off quickly. And if they're not actually mitigated when a wildfire breaks out, it becomes a major, major issue for us to be able to spread the fire and to be able to accelerate it. You may not know this, but Oklahoma occasionally has severe weather. I know that may be a shock to everybody. So occasionally when we have severe weather, that lightning will also break out a fire, and that has become a long-term issue for us as well. So a lot of our critical infrastructure continues to be able to deal with how they can manage those issues. We also have fires that break out, like it happens at times with our electrical power grid. And so that is an issue that we still need to be able to resolve, and it will be hopefully a part of our conversation today on grid wildfires, as well as occasionally a lightning strike that hits an oil battery or whatever it may be, or just to be able to catch some of the grass on fire and it takes off from there. Among our witnesses today, they're coming from states with a lot of federal land. Federal bureaucracy, I would say, should not prevent us from quickly responding to wildfires. We do have some additional contracting issues as far as the date of contract. So for instance, in Oklahoma, our date of contracting for wildfire assistance begins on March the 1st. Did I mention that our wildfires came in on the end of February this year? And so just getting federal assistance to be able to come in, because for our wildfires happened to come in before the contracting date set, created additional problems for us. So we do have some red tape we've got to be able to work through. When disaster strikes, we should be able to respond to those. One of the issues that Senator Daines, Representative Issa, and I are working on to remove some of the red tape is on the hiring issues. We have a bill called Direct Hire to Fires Act that we're working to be able to make sure that we can actually get to some of those firefighters faster to the task on it, to be able to resolve some of the hiring issues so we're not having to have those delays just in the hiring to be able to get folks on the ground. So appreciate the hearing. This is a big issue for us nationally. It is a tremendous cost to the federal taxpayer, but it's a bigger cost to those that are actually impacted by the fire on the ground.
Thank you, Senator Langford. It's the practice of this committee to swear in witnesses. So if each of you would please stand and raise your right hands. Do you swear that the testimony that you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated. Our first witness is Lori Morell. She is the U.S. Fire Administrator for FEMA. She oversees efforts to support and strengthen fire and emergency medical services to prepare for, prevent, mitigate, and respond to all hazards. Prior to that role, Dr. Morell served at the helm of the International Public Safety Data Institute and worked as a senior executive in the International Association of Firefighters. Since beginning her career as a paramedic for the City of Memphis Fire Department 37 years ago, she has become a renowned expert on public safety and fire service. Dr. Morell, you are now recognized for your opening remarks.
Thank you, Senator Peters and Ranking Member Paul, Senator Romney, and the members of the committee. Certainly thank you for your well-informed opening statements. I am Lori Morell, the U.S. Fire Administrator within the Federal Emergency Management Agency. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today and to discuss the continuous and evolving wildfire threat. Before we can effectively examine the impact on wildfire on the nation, we must first clarify terminology, however. Historically, there's been a propensity for federal decision-making to refer to wildland fire in laws intended to reduce the impact on communities. And to clarify, wildland is a location made up of vegetation, while wildland-urban interface and wildland intermixed communities are referred to as the interface, and these are areas where human development meets or intermingles with underdeveloped wildland vegetative fuels that are both fire-dependent and fire-prone. Ultimately, this confusion in terminology has led to limited resources to address the threat of wildfire before it occurs in the built environment. Throughout much of the United States and globally, wildfires are growing in intensity, size, and destructiveness, as you've noted. The expansion of our communities into new locations also contributes to the risk we face. It's imperative that the states and local officials adopt, implement, and enforce national wildland-urban interface building codes. In response to these challenges, the Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and the U.S. Fire Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, Forest Service, the Department of Interior were directed by Congress, as you know, through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to lead the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission. The Wildland Fire, or Wildfire Mitigation and Management Commission, was charged with recommending improvements on how federal agencies manage wildfire across the landscapes. The Commission's final report of 148 recommendations covering several themes, including putting significantly more focus on resources toward proactive pre-fire and post-fire planning to break the current cycle of increasingly severe wildfire risk, damages, and losses. Another theme of the report was modernizing tools to inform decision-making, including several measures that would better coordinate, integrate, and strategically align fire-related science, data, and technology. A major commission recommendation for the United States Fire Administration is that we provide expanded community-based wildfire training and engagement of the nation's non-federal fire service to promote fire-adapted communities, to build community resilience, and improve coordination with wildfire management in the interface. These recommendations and actions would have been particularly valuable to address the Lahaina Maui fire before the fire occurred. I accompanied the FEMA administrator to Lahaina Maui 48 hours after the fire. My overall focus on the ground was to get a firsthand look at the indications of how the fire moved, likely wind impact, the fuel load that enabled rapid and extensive fire spread, indications of human behavior during evacuation, and overall firefighter well-being. USFA's focus is now on the post-fire mitigation opportunities through the FEMA Mitigation Assessment Team and increasing resilience during the build-back in Lahaina. To assist with building resilience, USFA, in coordination with the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology, is deploying several wildfire sensors on Maui, along with the other fire-prone islands in the state. Sensory technology is a critical part of the effective wildfire response, providing real-time, accurate information on these fires as early as possible post-ignition, so that resources can be quickly deployed to engage in suppression. However, we need continual investments and updates on existing wildfire models, as well as additional training for firefighters to respond to these events. The increasing incidence of wildfire that affect communities means that more municipal fire departments are responsible for firefighting in the wildland and in the interface. The reality is that local firefighters must add interface and suburban conflagration, wildfire strategies and tactics to their operational skill set. Lastly, fire departments cannot safely and effectively respond to the wildland or the interface fires without proper protective equipment. The USFA, along with the federal, state, and local partners, are actively participating in preparedness, including community risk reduction, where we're engaging with individuals and their communities through fire stop tours across the nation. It's a goal to prepare all local firefighters, structural firefighters, and communities for increase in wildfires in the interface and the rural and suburban communities. We anticipate challenges ahead. FEMA and the USFA looks forward to working with the members of this community and this committee to build a more resilient nation. I want to thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you. I'd like to now recognize Senator Rosen to introduce our second witness.
Well, thank you, Chairman Peters, and it is my distinct honor and pleasure to introduce Nevada's own David Fogerson, Chief of the Nevada Division of Emergency Management and the Office of Homeland Security. Welcome, Chief. Chief Fogerson has over 30 years of experience in public safety, serving in a number of different roles, including as a wildland firefighter himself and as Deputy Fire Chief and Emergency Manager for Nevada. In our state of Nevada, the unique landscape, the changing climate, the amount of land owned by the federal government, over 80%, by the way, make wildfire mitigation and recovery all the more challenging. And that's why we need strong leaders like Chief Fogerson who create collaborative partnerships and encourage innovation in our approach to addressing wildfires. We are so lucky to have someone with as much experience and insight as Chief Fogerson leading Nevada's response to devastating wildfires and working with leaders across the country to address the increasing challenges that wildfires are now presenting. Nevada needs to be, we must be at the table in these important conversations. And so it's why I'm pleased that Chief Fogerson represented our state on the Wildland Fire Mitigation Management Commission, which was charged with making these important recommendations to Congress on wildfire strategies and response. And I think you won't find a state in the nation anymore that is immune from wildfires. I'm so glad to have you here today testifying before this committee. We thank you for their service to our state, and I think the chairman will recognize you for your opening remarks.
Mr. Fogerson, you're now recognized for your opening comments.
Chairman Peters, Ranking Member Paul, Nevada Senator Rosen, and distinguished members of this committee, it's my esteemed pleasure to speak with you about our nation's wildfire threat. This is my 30th Nevada wildfire season. I was a deputy fire chief responsible for negotiating the cooperative fire protection agreements with both the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management based upon the Reciprocal Fire Protection Act of 1954. As with all Western state emergency managers, wildfire continues to be my life's work. I am before you today as a member of the Wildfire Commission. I believe the Commission was empowered and envisioned to rethink the path on wildfire. 50 diverse commissioners agreed upon 148 recommendations with 100% consensus. That should add weight to our story. We want to buy down our risks. This occurs when we treat wildfire as we do a hurricane, with a whole community approach. This occurs when we support partnerships to ensure everyone has a seat at the table. This occurs when we support workforce development and realize we no longer have a fire season, but rather a fire year. H.R. 77 speaks to treating wildfire as we do hurricanes, and I urge its support. We don't care who owns the hurricane. We react as a collective community to support survivor outcomes using an enterprise-wide approach. During projected landfall, federal agencies work collaboratively to move resources to support state and local responses. Funds are provided to pre-position resources. Emergency operations centers are open with a mindset to protect the whole community. Partners come together. Our nation's response to wildfire is quite different. A red flag warning did not trigger local, state, federal, and tribal nation coordination to prepare. When we hear the Santa Anas in Southern California or the Washoe Zephyrs in Northern Nevada, there's no openings in emergency operations centers, no community-wide approach, and no collective movement of resources, as wildfire is still viewed as a responsibility of whichever agency manages the land, segregated by property lines and jurisdictions. We need an outcome-based view, one of consequence management, as we do with hurricanes. The evacuation coordination effort currently being led by the Fire Administration is of paramount importance. In fact, Nevada and California is holding a bi-state workshop on this issue in 2 weeks. Our responsibility includes accounting for the cascading hazards wildfire brings. We know floods follow fire. Tying flood to the fire is essential for resource-poor communities to protect the residents and visitors. Collaboration is key given the role that local governments play in wildfire response. In Nevada, local governments provide structural firefighters are our primary wildfire responders. Federal grants such as FMAG, EMPG, AFG, and SAFER help local governments fight the fire and not their checkbook. Administrator Criswell is working to increase FEMA's nimbleness. No one wants fraud, waste, and abuse. We want nimbleness to create the best outcomes in the shortest amount of time. There's a fine balancing act between those two needs, a balance point we must continually seek. FEMA and the U.S. Fire Administration needs our support to ensure they are positioned to support the whole community. They must be sufficiently resourced and funded for wildfire planning, preparation, response, recovery, and mitigation. Our federal land management agency partners spend their entire careers dedicated to wildfire. These professionals need adequate salary, benefit, and respect, and the workforce must be grown to a year-round one can provide for mitigation activities outside of fighting fire. The idea of a fire season lasting from May to October is no longer a reality in Nevada. Nevada sees a year-round fire season with our largest loss of civilian life and property during winter wildfires, when our federal partners are not staffed to support response. I've managed many winter wildfires asking for additional engines, hand crews, and air support, only to be reminded it is out of season and local government is the depth of the resources available. Local governments are a critical component of wildfire response, year-round and around the clock. The same firefighter that responds to your difficulty breathing call, to your structure fire, to your motor vehicle collision with extrication needs is your wildfire responder year-round. We must allow for more rapid reimbursement to make the local government whole for their efforts. This will allow them to grow their capabilities and remain engaged. The Reciprocal Fire Act of 1954 remains an impediment to the local government partners. I thank you for this opportunity to testify today. It is an honor and a highlight of my career. My passion is to ensure that we are learning from experience and improving our systems, for to those who much is given, much is expected. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Fogerson. Before we introduce our next witness, recognize Senator Carper for 1 minute for a brief remark.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, I represent the state of Delaware. We don't have a lot of wildfires. We have a lot of firefighters, and we revere them and the good work that they do. We have challenges that emanate from the ocean. We have sea level rise and wiping out parts of our beaches and our farmland along the coast. And it's not just Delaware. It's all up and down the East Coast, the West Coast as well. I like to say, in my state, it's not enough just to address the symptoms of sea level rise and the devastation that comes from that. We have to address root causes. We all know what the root cause is. It's climate change. It's too much carbon in the air. The good news is we're doing a lot as a country, I think leading the world in addressing that, and we need to do more of that. We'll not only make sure we have great beaches in places like Delaware, but also make sure that we'll have fewer wildfires to fight across the country. Thank you all for being here. Welcome. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Carper. I need to step away to an Armed Services Committee to ask some questions. So I will be passing the gavel over to Senator Romney. Senator Romney will be chairing this hearing while I step away. Senator Romney.
Yeah, I'll be a good boy. I won't do anything that will embarrass you, Mr. Chairman. I promise. Although it's mostly Republicans here, so we might.
I have a tremendous amount of trust in you, my friend.
All right. Thank you. We're going to hear from Director Barnes. Jimmy Barnes is currently serving as a Utah State Forester and Director of Utah's Division of Forestry, Fire, and State Lands. Prior to this, she was responsible for the Sovereign Lands Program in our state. She, by the way, got her master's degree at University of Idaho. She obviously went astray from our northern border, but her undergraduate is from Weber State University. Director Barnes, we're happy to have you here, and we turn to you for your testimony.
Thank you, Senator Romney. Good morning, and thank you, Chairman Peters and members of the committee. I'm pleased to be here with you today to take the opportunity to appear before you and to discuss wildfire. We are no stranger to the development occurring in our wildland-urban interface communities. With urban growth comes an increased risk of devastating wildfire. Many of these areas contain an overgrowth of fuels. We are seeing fires burn hotter and more severely than ever. Many states across the western U.S. now refer to fire season as fire year. Increased fire occurrence and severity also lead to more days of wildfire smoke in our communities. The increased severity and intensity of fires outside the typical fire season is demonstrated by the recent destructive wildfires experienced in places like Colorado, Maui, and most recently Texas. The unexpected is no longer unexpected. It is the new normal. In addition to states being faced with the increasing suppression costs of altered fire regimens, private landowners are now being pressured to reduce the amount of fuels on their landscape. While this may reduce the individual risk of wildfires, communities have little control of wildfires beyond their property boundary. We do have tools in the toolbox that we can use to help mitigate hazardous fuels and actively manage our lands, as prescribed fire is one of them. However, it becomes complex, and when dealing with air quality standards, permitting challenges, and with mechanical treatments and cross-boundary landscapes. The majority of the focus around air quality is out of proportion to the frequency and ferocity of wildfires. Wildfires can negate any improvement of air quality in a single incident. Utah spends the majority of its summer months inundated with smoke from wildfires of other states. With this in mind, we must remember the true cost of wildfire. Each year, wildfire suppression dollars are reported and used widely to bring into context the severity of wildfire season. In reality, suppression is only a fraction of the cost. When assessing the full cost of wildfire, we must consider the long-term and complex costs from loss of life, safety, infrastructure, and ecosystem services. Utah's collaborative relationships lead to our successes. We believe in strong interagency collaboration. Shared stewardship and fire sense are examples of how the Utah Way achieves goals. The shared stewardship approach brings partners together and stakeholders together to focus on doing the right work in the right place at the right scale. Since 2019, the Shared Stewardship Program in Utah has invested $30 million in active forest management, treating over 80,000 acres. This initiative has improved Utah's watersheds through a collaborative approach. FireSense, a state-sponsored campaign with interagency collaboration to educate Utah citizens and visitors, is a wildfire prevention campaign. Utahns have successfully reduced human-caused wildfires by over 60% in the last 3 years. That's absolutely amazing. Wildfire Mitigation and Management Commission Act released a report with key findings that are important to Utah with regard to mitigating, managing, and recovering from wildfires. In the last decade, Utah has seen large wildfires and escape prescribed burn projects impact our watersheds. The report identified ways to make planning more effective and efficient. This is one approach that Utah has been very proactive in with shared stewardship, but with limited funding. There are still limitations to achieving large landscape scale projects due to NEPA's litigation challenges, the need for permitting reform, and the lack of mechanisms for forest management. Also, limited funding is available for post-wildfire restoration at the state level. Providing additional funding would help the recovery from a significant wildfire event. Forestry Fire in State Lands evaluates the state of Utah wildfire risk by considering resources and values at risk in an area to determine fire risk. These same metrics should be used to prioritize success of mitigation work and not just the number of acres treated. Current federal performance metrics use solely on metrics around acres treated. Lastly, prioritizing investment in building a workforce is important throughout the nation. Firefighter pay has been at the center of discussions for years now. Utah recently passed legislation addressing the pay of state wildland firefighters. Having an equally paid interagency workforce should be a priority. We need to learn to live with fire being the new normal. We need to fight fire with fire, putting more fire on the landscape through prescribed burning with lower intensity burning and less impact to air quality. Increasing funding and capacity, along with finding ways to strengthen relationships, is the key to successful forest management and reducing the number of wildfires throughout the nation. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Director Barnes. Chair recognizes Senator Sinema to introduce the fourth witness.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am pleased to be able to introduce my friend and member of the Wildfire Mitigation and Management Commission, Lucinda Andreani. Lucinda serves as the Deputy County Manager and Flood Control District Administrator for Coconino County in Arizona, where we have worked together on many critical projects for the people of northern Arizona, from resiliency planning to delivering key post-fire and post-flood resources, to seeing firsthand the people in neighborhoods in Flagstaff devastated by post-fire flooding. Lucinda has been a champion for rethinking the ways we plan for and respond to wildfires in our country, and her appointment to this important commission is a testament to her dedication to northern Arizona. I cannot thank Lucinda enough for her exemplary work co-chairing the post-wildfire working group with another witness we have at today's hearing, Mr. Fogerson. I look forward to Lucinda's testimony and continuing our work to deliver results for all Arizonans who are affected by the growing threat of wildfires. Thank you. Thanks, Lucinda.
Senator Romney, Senator Sinema, and distinguished members of the committee, I'm honored to testify. From the shores of Hawaii to the panhandle of Texas, wildfire ravages tens of millions of acres and thousands of communities. Even once the wildfires are extinguished, secondary impacts such as loss of housing and post-wildfire flooding threaten the health and safety of affected communities for years. I am Lucinda Andreani, and I serve as Coconino County, Arizona's Deputy County Manager and Flood Control District Administrator. I am responsible for mitigating the impacts of wildfires and post-wildfire flooding, and my duties include leading the district's forest restoration initiative. I can tell you firsthand, the scale of these crises rapidly overwhelms the capacity of local governments. While there are opportunities for federal support, much must be done to improve the accessibility, immediacy, and effectiveness of the federal response to the wildfire crisis. I also was privileged to represent counties across the country as I served on the congressionally established Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission. It is counties that generally bear the brunt of wildfire disasters. I want to thank Senator Sinema for her continuing leadership with and significant contributions to improving wildfire prevention, response, and recovery. Her support of the county's efforts have been steadfast and are deeply appreciated by the county and our residents, and me personally as well. Since 2010, Coconino County has endured 9 major wildfires, issued over 25,000 evacuation orders, lost over 130 buildings, including 63 homes, and wildfires have released 4.1 million metric tons of carbon. I'd like to focus on some key issues relative to how FEMA can improve wildfire recovery processes. Commission Recommendation 64 advocates for amending the Stafford Act to reflect the cascading, repetitive nature of post-wildfire flooding. Although cumulative impacts usually exceed the minimum for a declaration, the disaster events are separated by 72-hour windows. As a result, Coconino County has lost access to millions of dollars in FEMA reimbursements and has virtually no access to the public assistance program. Commission Recommendation 79 calls for protecting taxpayer investments by ensuring that FEMA funds can be applied to infrastructure improvements, not just in-kind replacements. In Coconino County, we have seen wildfire-impacted watersheds discharge up to 26 times more floodwater than they did in pre-wildfire conditions. Congressional action is needed to allow FEMA to reimburse for upfront short-term flood mitigation and infrastructure preparation costs for post-wildfire flooding. While some areas may qualify for NRCS's exigency program, FEMA should reimburse local governments and tribes that do not qualify for NRCS exigency and to prepare infrastructure for the dramatically increased flood flows. Furthermore, exigency funding through FEMA may provide a tangential benefit to the National Flood Insurance Program. Now I want to quickly turn to increasing the resiliency to wildfires. While the BIL and IRA funding has significantly improved federal investments in forest restoration, additional funding will be needed across the West to reduce the threat of catastrophic wildfires, as called out in Commission Recommendation 126. Improving the resiliency of the built environment is also important, as is identified in Commission Recommendation 6. I am glad to see FEMA's BRIC and HMGP programs are now focusing on fuels reduction within communities. However, streamlining FEMA's processes is greatly needed. Our county received a fuels reduction grant, but because of these slow processes, it will take over 5 years to implement. The wildfire crisis cannot be dealt with as business as usual. In Coconino County, we have become adept at navigating the systems and forming the partnerships to secure aid to address post-wildfire impacts. But this is not the case for most areas, such as our neighboring state of New Mexico. The Commission's Recommendation 60 calls for major improvements in federal agency coordination. Thank you again for the opportunity to provide testimony. A robust, unified response from all levels of government is needed. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that testimony. I'm just going to note that you may wonder why it is that people are coming in and out from this front row here. That's because there are other hearings going on that we have responsibility to attend and in some cases to chair. I would also note that the people who are going to be doing drafting on legislation and implementing many of the recommendations from the commission, they're the ones sitting behind us. So the workers are the ones sitting in these back rows here, and they're not leaving. They're here to make sure that we actually turn into law some of the recommendations that are being made by the commission. Our final witness is Christopher P. Currie. He serves as Director of Homeland Security and Justice of the Government Accountability Office. Mr. Currie leads the GAO's work in emergency management and disaster response and evaluates the efficiency of certain programs within DHS, including FEMA. He has served in the GAO since 2002. We have seen him a number of times before, as you can imagine. Mr. Currie, you're now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you very much, Senator Romney and other members of the committee. It's an honor to be here today to talk about GAO's work on wildfire preparedness, response, and recovery. I'm not going to repeat all the challenges about wildfires. I think everyone's covered that pretty well. And the 150 or so Wildfire Commission recommendations show how big of a problem this is. But what I want to do is get into some nuts and bolts and really lay out 3 key points based on the years of work we've done on this area and talking to almost every state in the country as well and listening to the challenges they face. The first point is that the current federal system hasn't really caught up to the modern threat of wildfires. It's very similar to, I think, what we were facing in 2005 with Katrina when we weren't ready for those types of disasters. The current system focuses on suppression and mitigation in rural and federal lands. And what we've seen is that wildfires are now affecting very populated areas over the last 10 years. FEMA is becoming a lot more involved because more people and infrastructure are being affected. So traditionally, land management agencies like the Forest Service and Interior have had separate missions from FEMA. Now that this is changing, there needs to be better coordination between the two. As others have mentioned on the panel, there needs to be a much more holistic approach from start to finish about this. Some examples I love to throw out are, states have told us, for example, that if a wildfire starts on federal land, you can't actually access certain FEMA grants and programs until that wildfire crosses into state or city land. And that's just an archaic process that's tied up in how these programs have been applied for other types of disasters and in statute. Wildfire smoke's another example. As you can imagine, EPA and the Forest Service have very different priorities as it pertains to wildfire smoke. The Forest Service wants to use prescribed burns to mitigate against fires. EPA wants to stop smoke to increase air quality. So these are just the types of things that we have to work out as we change the dynamic with wildfires. The second point is in our work, federal assistance has struggled to really help individuals and communities with wildfires. As was mentioned, a lot of these programs were developed for hurricanes, floods, and other tornadoes and other types of disasters, which it's already a huge challenge in those areas. But it's even more difficult because wildfires are very unique. The best example I like to provide is housing after a disaster with survivors. You can't put a FEMA trailer on a burned out house. The soil is toxic. The debris has to be actually removed, and the fire completely destroys the house or the community. That's another unique aspect to this, is that often the entire structure or community is gone. It takes much longer to rebuild. You have to completely redesign and build up to the current code. Way more difficult than just rebuilding a house in a neighborhood after it floods or after it's hit by a hurricane. The other challenge is just shortages of disaster housing for survivors afterwards. We've seen this in Maui and in California. These things tend to hit in places that are extremely expensive for housing. There's not a lot of hotels and other things to put disaster survivors in. Recently, when I was in Maui, a local official reminded me that average family home there is about $1.5 million. So they don't have a bunch of small houses sitting around for temporary housing for survivors. So FEMA and its federal partners and state and local partners are going to have to work together to figure out, before fires happen, what we're going to do with survivors when they're taking years to rebuild their homes. The last point I'd like to talk about is just federal disaster assistance in general. What we hear consistently everywhere we go around the country is these programs are way too complicated. Recovery programs, they take a long time. They're very frustrating to navigate. And when you're trying to use multiple federal programs together for recovery, it becomes almost close to impossible in some people's view. This is something that we're going to have to change. We've made recommendations on how we can do this. We actually suggested it was such a big problem that there needed to be a specific commission set up to handle just disaster recovery reform in general. So many things need to take place to change the way we look at wildfire preparedness, response, and recovery. So thank you for the chance to be here, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Director Currie, and appreciate the work that you do and that all of our panel members do to help protect our citizens and our land. I'm going to direct my first question to Director Barnes, but you others are free to comment on it as well. Director Barnes, you noted the importance of forestry management, but said that there are regulatory barriers that make it difficult for us to effectively manage our forests. What are the barriers that the Commission identified, or just based on your own experience, what things should we focus on to be able to make it more likely that we'll be able to effectively manage the forest prior to a wildfire?
Yeah, thanks, Senator Romney. So I think some of those barriers are definitely the NEPA process that we're going through. Permitting reform is something that we definitely need to be focusing on. Also, efficiencies across agencies is something that we should be focusing on, and how we can do better planning efforts. Honestly, in Utah, we do things very well with our interagency partners. I often tell people, if everybody could do it the Utah way, the world would be a lot better. We've worked on that very hard through shared stewardship, but I think breaking down those barriers through NEPA, the litigation issues that we see that are very costly, and then also the alignment, getting everything aligned to have a project happen. That's a tricky thing for things to happen. Air quality, if you're doing prescribed fire, permitting, everything lining up all together to make things work, it becomes complicated and complex at times.
I'm going to add that to this question, just personal observation, having driven through a number of the forests in our state. I was astounded to see that in some cases, perhaps as much as 2/3 of the wood, of the trees, are dead. And if they're harvested, I'm told within 3 years or so, they can be used for chipboard and so forth. But the process of getting a permit to harvest this dead wood takes so long that it's no longer useful, and therefore has no economic value. Therefore, we can't get loggers to come in and take out the dead wood. Does the Commission make any recommendations that would allow us to actually use some of the dead wood and to get private sector participants to come in and remove some of the fuel that adds to the danger of these wildfires?
Absolutely, and that's an important piece of the puzzle in Utah. And again, through shared stewardship, that's one of the approaches that we have taken. We have invested in a position of a wood utilization specialist within the division, and having that person to determine what wood is out there, how can we utilize that wood, and how can we get that wood off to the forest to be an economic benefit in the state is something that we're very focused on, and we're starting to build success in that area. It's a very important topic.
Thank you. I'd be happy to hear from any other member of the panel that would like to address this as well. Yes, Director?
Thank you. One of the commission recommendations does point to the needed continuing and additional needed investment in biomass utilization technologies and investments in those businesses. Because much of this, the wood in the West, particularly in Ponderosa Pine area, is very low or no value. And we need to look at other ways that we can create value out of those products. So continuing investments in those areas is going to be critical.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me turn to another topic that you raised, which is the workforce and the pay. Again, Director Barnes, you indicated a desire to provide the appropriate pay between state and local individuals, but there's been discussion about the difference in pay with federal as well as state and local, and how those compare and the conflict that may exist. Likewise, in this regard, there's some discussion about full-time versus part-time. At the federal level, we have part-time individuals? Who wants to take a job that's going to require you to have a salary or provide a salary for you maybe 5 or 6 months a year, but the rest of the year you got no pay? Are there solutions in this regard that you all have that we need to consider?
Yeah, Senator Romney. So recently, a couple of years ago, Utah passed HB 65, which increased wildfire pay. We increased that and brought people up to the level which we felt was comparable with federal pay of federal wildland firefighters. Right now, we feel that Utah is in a good place compared with our federal partners, but there is still that compensation bracket with regard to benefits. Some of our time-limited firefighters that fight fire just throughout the season do not receive a benefits package, so that's also an important piece of that puzzle. Bringing people on, as we talked about, fire season is not just fire season anymore, it's fire year. So compensating is very important. It's also very important to not have a swift difference in firefighter pay from agency to agency. When a fire happens, it knows no boundary. We're all out on the landscape, we're working together, we're working to put that fire out. So if you're a state wildland firefighter or you're a federal wildland firefighter, we should all be making an amount that is similar so that there's no difference in what these people are doing out there in saving our resources.
Thank you. Any other individuals, please?
Please,
Dr.
thank you,
Morell?
Senator, for that. I'd just like to, if I may, transition just a bit to our local firefighters. As you've noted, there is a shortage of wildland firefighters, but certainly we're having a shortage in the structural side as well, and it's up to the structural firefighters to often cover on federal, state lands regardless. They are the first boots on the ground, not a federal firefighter. And so our local firefighters, and I'd like to express my gratitude certainly to the Senate for already have passed the SAFER Act. This is critical to making sure that we can continue to recruit structural firefighters across the nation because we are on the edge of a shortage nationwide.
Thank you. Any others have any comment? If not, I'm going to turn to Senator Butler and let her take over. Obviously, we're very much aware of the tragedies and the wildfires that have occurred in California in recent years. Appreciate your being here and turn to you for questions you may have.
Thank you, Senator Romney, and thank you to all of the witnesses and my colleagues who are here. I appreciate you marking the moment, Senator Romney, for our colleagues who are, having to do multiple things sort of all at the same time because I don't think it is a reflection. Please don't see it as a reflection of the commitment of this body to this incredibly important issue. I think it's an important note for those who are watching to understand what's happening here. I would love to pick up on this conversation about firefighters because I think that they are just a critical asset to the entire sort of complex puzzle that you all are managing as it relates to community safety and environmental standards as well as land preservation. As was noted, Dr. Morell, Director Morell, the Senate appropriations package last week that extended what is the temporary pay increase for federal wildland firefighters. I think it is important for us to note that at least the data that I've seen in President Biden's fiscal year 2025 budget proposal that Congress must now pass a permanent increase to the base pay to give our nation's firefighters the long-term certainty that everyone here has spoken to. Now, Dr. Morell, I've heard estimates that Congress, that had we not extended the pay increase, 30 to 50% of federal wildland firefighters might have left their jobs. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how a reduction of this scale might impact the federal government's ability to be the kind of partner that I hear is required in order to meet this crisis that we're dealing with.
Absolutely. Thank you, ma'am, for the question. Certainly, I'll address your initial question about what would be the impact if we lost that many firefighters across the nation, certainly our federal firefighters. It's huge because then it defaults to our local and state. They are already covering because there is a shortage. If we don't pay the federal firefighters, the wildland firefighters, and pay them year-round to take on what is their responsibility on federal lands, to be there first and initially, the burden is still falling on our local firefighters to get there, and then when they can deploy from the federal wildland or interior or other agencies, they are arriving, but it's later. We've already noted the impact if we don't get to these ignitions quickly. So we must have resources. The other thing is sustainability of the pay for our wildland federal firefighters, not just a bonus pay, not just a one-time that's not pensionable. They need pay increase. Right now, they can go and apply at Target or somewhere and make almost double what they're making an hour here. And our most skilled set, our smoke jumpers, these and others, and I'm certainly going to defer to the forester here in the room to answer this, but this is something that we must address as our workforce across the board.
Say it louder for the people in the back. Thank you so much for making that point so clear. Relying on the people that we have to do this work is critically important. Mr. Fogerson, I'm going to turn to you for my next question. As was noted and is widely known and reported, California has been just sort of ground zero for so much of the accelerated experience of wildfire that we're experiencing as a country. In 2018, our Camp Fire killed 85 people, destroyed 19,000 homes, burned 153,000 acres, and cost nearly $17 billion in damages. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, impacted individuals struggled to access adequate shelter. Those who did access shelter faced an outbreak of norovirus and crime. Nearly 6 years after the fire, many of the affected areas have yet to rebuild. Further, elderly individuals made up a majority of the 85 fatalities, demonstrating the disproportionate impacts of wildfires on vulnerable populations. Mr. Fogerson, your testimony highlights the ongoing struggle of Butte County and the towns of Paradise, Magalia, Concow, and Butte Creek Canyon to recover and rebuild. You note in your testimony that it remains an important watermark for you in the context of the whole community recovery. Can you elaborate on some takeaways from the Camp Fire and what you would suggest that we as Congress take as action?
Absolutely. Thank you for the question, ma'am. You know, those fires were the first time when we really saw the huge impact of loss of major homes in a resource-poor community. And that resource-poor community is a rural frontier community, much like we see Northern California and Nevada. When we look at it from the southern states, when we have a hurricane, we're able to go put a FEMA trailer out. We're able to do those things. And so everyone has in their mindset, that's how we're going to do it. But we can't actually do that on the West Coast, especially as my friend from the GAO said, you can't just go put a trailer on a burned out section of land because of what happens with the dirt. And so the take homes that I've taken from it is looking at how are we going to house these people long term. It's not just going to be a 30-day, we're going to have to put this person up, but how do we figure out how to make encampments or something along those lines to take care of these people for the longer term period of time. I have a neighbor that lives in Gardnerville, Nevada with me and came from the Camp Fire area, had his house burned down, and was unable because of supply chain issues and COVID to actually rebuild his house, had to relocate to another community. And so how do we look at those things? How do we fix that so that way we have that in our pocket? And that's where I see FEMA as being a big partner in this and treating that wildfire as we do hurricanes and not as a land management issue that encroached upon privately owned property.
Thank you so much. And I have lots of questions for all of you in a limited amount of time. I'd love to just end with a comment. All of you have, in your testimony, referred to disaster recovery. And I think that is an incredibly important focus and appreciate you for highlighting it. One of the topics that we haven't touched on yet is the recovery of industries that are not explicitly covered under the FEMA programs. In particular, I'm concerned with the recovery of the agriculture community and industry in California. Wildfires, which have become increasingly worse, have an extreme impact not just on California's farmers, but on the food supply that drives up costs for groceries of every day families. And I just want to urge my colleagues as we consider and do our work that we work together in a bipartisan way to not only ensure that FEMA has the resources it needs to address disaster recovery, but that we're also providing funding for the Department of Agriculture's Emergency Relief Program. So that we're ensuring that agricultural providers and producers can have robust and timely recovery so that we could all work together to continue to bring down costs for working families. Thank you.
Senator Johnson, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding this hearing. I think it's really fascinating. I come from a state where we obviously have forest fires, but generally not the extent as you have out west. So I do find this fascinating, and I actually appreciate whether you are on board with climate change or not. I don't think I even heard that word used, because we're talking about the practical things we can do, and I want to focus on that. Again, not coming from a western state, Ms. Andreani, you talked about the post-fire and the flooding afterwards. Is it because these things are sparked by huge thunderstorms and that cause, or is there something else occurring? Is there lack of vegetation that's not absorbing the moisture? I mean, just to describe what's happening geologically that you have post-fire floods. I'm fascinated by that.
Thank you, Senator. We, in the Southwest, and actually Utah, other areas of the West, experience what's called, a monsoon, a traditional monsoon in the summer, typically anywhere from end of June through September. And then certainly you've seen in California, the atmospheric rivers, you've seen other types of rainfall events, mountain thunderstorms that can create post-wildfire flooding. So that's the dynamic. What you see on the ground is that when a wildfire occurs, particularly if it's a severe wildfire with very severe impacts to the soil actually becomes hydrophobic.
So it can't absorb it.
It acts like glass. And that will typically take place through an initial season, maybe even longer depending upon the circumstances. And so you get this massive increase in flood flows. We have seen in an area recently that was burned up to 26 times the pre-fire flood flows in those areas. So you're getting massive removal of sediment. In many of these areas, we have steep slopes that have burned very severely. So you're getting massive wasting of sediment, debris that's coming from the wooded area. You no longer have any foliage to deflect the rainfall, and so you see these catastrophic events after
Again,
after the fire.
It's coincidental. I mean, it's the massive flooding is caused by the fact they had a fire beforehand, but and oftentimes it occurs more than 72 hours, then that's a problem for federal funding.
Exactly. There's this window between events, and so, for example, after the pipeline fire in 2022, we had 45 major flood events that summer. But if you have once you have a flood event, then they create a 72-hour window within which you aren't eligible. And so we never reach, even though the total amount is over double our current threshold, financial threshold for a declaration, we never met the declaration level. So that means we're not eligible for reimbursement, and it means we're not eligible for public assistance.
So again, I think we're all aware that the federal government creates these rules. Sometimes they're at cross purposes, and sometimes they don't make sense. So again, I appreciate the testimony so that we can hopefully get that in better alignment. At the same time, permitting and the cross purposes of the agencies. I know Ms. Currie mentioned the fact that the EPA is all about reducing smoke, but one of the mitigating factors would be to do controlled burns. So, Mr. Fogerson, you mentioned your groups, your agencies got together and you came up with, I think you said, 148 different recommendations that were 100% agreed to. Laying aside the financing and some of those permitting, can you talk about the mitigation? Because I've always heard we're just not removing the fuel. Talk about controlled burns. I mean, what are the best things we can do in terms of mitigation that everybody agrees to?
Absolutely, sir. Thank you very much. This is a very wicked problem. There's not an easy answer that we just need to do more prescribed burns on the forest lands, because we're talking forest lands, we're talking rangelands, we're talking the built environment. And so it's using the biomass tools that we talked about earlier, so that way we can take out the dead and down timber that is not salvageable for costing. using the logging operations, doing controlled burn operations. And we do run into some issues with controlled burn operations because when we look at using FEMA hazard mitigation funds, we're not allowed to do controlled burns, but we can do controlled burns using federal, using Forest Service or BLM funds.
But you also have problems with anti-loggers, that type of thing as well, right?
100%. And that's why it's kind of the wicked problem of how do we reduce the fuel volume in the forest environment, the rangeland environment, and the built environment. And some of that also involves using wildland urban interface codes. That way we have homeowners that are actually protecting their communities around it, tying our community wildland fire protection plans that are required for or dealing with the Forest Service and BLM with the FEMA's hazard mitigation plans. That way there's one cohesive plan on how we're going to reduce that risk.
You know, I continue to see, different charts saying that, we really don't have an increase in the number of acres being burned every year. Over time, it's actually decreased. But I think oftentimes, like hurricanes as well, we've just built up so much valuable real estate on the coast, or, we built, so many expensive homes in fire-prone areas. I mean, is that the issue here? And, I thought it was interesting, too. You can't have any federal funding until it actually crosses into state land, which, again, seems insane, but kind of understand that. Ms. Morell, you were...
Certainly, I'd like to address the building toward risk. You're absolutely right there, sir. We are building toward risk. We continue to build toward fire-prone lands. And if we do so without proper ingress and egress for the population living there, without proper building codes being implemented, adopted, and enforced using fire-resistant materials, we know that geography is going to burn. And so we have to pre-plan for that so that we don't have these disasters. Fire is going to be normal. We are going to have fire-adapted communities, but they must pre-plan. And the federal government cannot bring all the solutions to this. It's too big a problem. So individuals who choose to live there are going to have to mitigate their property. We are taking a heavy role in that, in education about what mitigation looks like. What does right look like? Keeping vegetation off your home, not using mulch, not having wood fences. These are very practical solutions to making a fire-prone community.
Well, just real quick, as you read more about the Maui and Lahaina disaster, people just knew that was a disaster waiting to hit, and just did. Is there kind of a booklet? Is there a publication of here are the real concerning areas? People weren't thinking about this before. They moved in there because people like to live around trees. Okay, have we identified these areas and we're just simply not addressing them, or what are we doing toward that? And apologize going over time here.
We are continuing to identify those risks. We can look at a fire risk index for the wild land for our forested areas. What we do not yet have is a fire risk index for the built environment. So as we build toward those risks, because of the building materials that are being used, because of climate change, which you appropriately brought up, the drought that we're having, all of the soil moisture reduction. So on one side of the island in Maui, it's perfectly green. On the other side, everything is dry. And so we're seeing that not only across the islands, but in areas across the nation that have never burned before, Louisiana, for example. And so these are areas that we have to pay attention. If we're going to build here, coupled with climate change, we've got to bring solution pre, not post necessarily.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. My bipartisan bill, the Fire Grants and Safety Act, reauthorizes the U.S. Fire Administration, the Assistance to Firefighters Grant Program, as well as the Staffing for Adequate Fire and Emergency Response Grant Program through 2030. The bill would also increase authorization of appropriations for the Fire Administration for the first time since 2012. Dr. Morell, can you share with us what the U.S. Fire Administration would do with these increased resources to better help protect our first responders who are preparing for these wildfires?
I appreciate that, sir, and thank you so much for shepherding that bill and for already passing those in the Senate. Yes, the U.S. Fire Administration needs the extra initiative, the funding, to be able to expand our own resources to prepare our firefighters across the nation to mitigate to be able to respond, and to be able to assist with recovery. It is imperative that we not only educate the communities, community engagement here has been made abundantly noted that the individuals are going to have to take responsibility, but it's our firefighters who connect with those individuals in their communities to teach them those things. And so we need that. We need the data. We need to be able to build a new analytics platform. Our National Fire Incident System was built in 1976. And so we need the funding to be able to build an appropriate data platform to inform this fire risk index that we have discussed. And so these funds are necessary to be able to elevate the USFA to an appropriate place where we can engage according to the recommendations in the commission. There are many there that talk about USFA's engagement at the community level with our structural firefighters across the nation, because they are the boots on the ground many times early on. So thank you for leaning into that.
Well, thank you for your answer. Mr. Fogerson, question for you is just how vital are these grant programs to local fire departments, especially given the fact that you are all finding yourselves on the front lines, protecting your communities, and resources are clearly stretched. But let this committee know how important these resources are.
Absolutely, sir, and thank you so much for the support of these grant programs. When I was the local government deputy fire chief, we had Assistance for Firefighters grants, and we had the Safer Grant program. When you look at especially the built environment, we're putting homes in these urban interface areas, but homes don't provide the tax revenue to start with. It takes a while for that tax revenue to catch up. And so when we put a subdivision in, we might not have the funding for staffing. These Safer grants have a cost shared from the federal government that varies over time that allows that local government to make that large investment. And I was able to do that. We had funds for 2 people, but we need 6 people to fill the 2 positions. And so we were able to use a Safer grant to hire the other 4. And then by the time the cost allocation came to 100% on our side instead of the cost share, we were able to absorb that in our budget. But we were able to, in that 4-year period, have 2 more additional firefighters on the streets, whereas we wouldn't have had that without that Safer grant. The Assistance for Firefighters grants, things are very expensive in the fire world. You're looking at a fire engine that we use on a wildland fire, Type 3 engine, costing $300,000 to $400,000. Our law enforcement partners get a lot of funds from the Department of Justice. Our public health friends get a lot of funds from CDC, ASPR. These are the fire services way of getting those funds for those high-ticket dollar items that are necessary to provide protection in our local communities, but might be out of the reach of some of these jurisdictions. And the competitive process that is used helps to ensure that we're giving it to the right places, I think, nationally.
Okay, thank you. Certainly the Maui fires are just a devastating example of how deadly these wildfires can destroy communities in catastrophic ways. And as a remote group of islands, Hawaii is especially vulnerable to disasters because it's difficult for resources to quickly reach the state when disaster strikes. FEMA has worked with other federal, state, and local partners to provide continuing relief and recovery to disaster survivors, with hundreds of FEMA staff deployed to Hawaii to assist in those local efforts. But Mr. Currie, my question is for you. You recently traveled to Hawaii to examine the recovery efforts. Would you mind sharing with the committee some of your top concerns for recovery at this point?
Sure. Yeah, we went there shortly after the fires hit and toured the affected areas. And a couple of them I mentioned in my opening statement. One of my biggest concerns after every disaster is housing for survivors. In a wildfire, it's 10 times harder than traditional disasters because you just, for many, many reasons. First of all, a lot of times these happen in remote locations and also in high-cost locations, whether it be Maui, California. There's not a lot of affordable housing that can be used temporarily, or hotels or things like that. So I think in Maui right now, according to FEMA, there's still almost 5,000 people that are in some type of hotel or temporary condominium situation. And so also with the fire, you have to wait a lot longer. If you have a flood, typically you can get your house ready to live in within months. Possibly with a fire, it could take years, and you're fighting with insurance, you're trying to get federal assistance. So FEMA does a really good job with really short-term housing, and then HUD can come in on the long end, but there's this middle ground where people often get stuck and they just don't have a good housing option. So housing is one of the biggest things that I see as the challenge. And the other thing is debris removal. This is always a really tough part of any disaster, but with fires, again, 10 times harder. The debris is toxic. You have to figure out where you can take it, how it's going to be excavated. You can imagine a lot of this is privately owned land, so people are very sensitive about just excavating and removing their property. And in Maui, they just now figured out where they're going to store this toxic property and treat it. So those are just two examples of fire that are just way more different and difficult than traditional disasters. And our system is just not, it's not prepared and designed to handle that yet.
Thank you. Senator Langford, you're recognized for your questions.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Thank you, all of you. Obviously, this is a national issue that we got to continue to be able to focus on. Appreciate the insight from folks that are on the ground. I want to talk a little bit about the permitting piece of this. Ms. Barnes, you brought this up earlier on it. What permitting issues do we need to try to be able to work through on federal permitting that post-wildfire or pre-wildfire that need to be done? So any ideas on, Ms. Barnes, you mentioned this earlier in your opening statement, but anyone can jump in on that.
Yeah, I can start on that, and thank you for the question. I think it's just that permitting reform of the alignment, the clearing indexes that we need to receive, the NEPA part of it. There's issues with contracting.
Kind of zero in, what's the NEPA piece?
Yeah, so NEPA often, and in Utah, gets held up a lot on litigation. That takes people away from that work that gets done on the ground. It takes a lot of staff time, a lot of money.
Is this post-fire or pre-fire?
Both. Any type of mitigation work or post-fire work that we're doing.
So is the issue there for NEPA, not that NEPA exists, it's the litigation around it, or what needs to be resolved?
It's the procedures that we need to go through on NEPA that get held up in litigation in order to get the projects done. And so working on those to find more efficiencies through that process, I think would be the best thing to avoid being held up in litigation. That takes a lot of staff time. It takes away from getting work done on the ground. And then having a clear sense of what can be done as far as mechanisms that we can do in the forest and categorical exclusions, what we can do to get through the process faster. The faster we can get through the process, the more work that we can get done on the ground.
Okay, when you talk about categorical exclusions, again, is this before fire and mediation, before or post?
I would say it would be both. In Utah, we're really looking at, we're years behind on getting work done. And so we need to be able to get in there, get work done. And then after a fire, there's an immediate need to get things done after a fire happens. But in order to get ahead of the wildfire crisis, we need to start mitigating hazardous fuels immediately.
Okay, any other permitting comments anybody make? Go ahead.
Thank you, Senator. Relative to forest restoration, pre-fire work.
I'm going to make sure your microphone's on there. Yeah, that's right.
Relative to forest restoration and the work that's necessary to improve the quality, habitat in the area, reduce the threat of wildfire. A couple other tools are that both FEMA and the Forest Service are typically limited in their willingness to allow third parties to potentially fund conducting the actual NEPA process on their behalf. So they're very limited in the resources that they have available internally to actually do that physical work on the ground, go out and do the cultural surveys, biological surveys. And we're utilizing, for example, in our area, our Good Neighbor Authority with the Forest Service to be able to actually perform some of that work on their behalf. They still go through the regulatory process. They still have to approve, or typically they go to a CADX, but we are able to step in and help with those costs and or resources that we have under contract to perform that work by credible, licensed professionals. And so bringing more flexibility, we approached FEMA about doing this for a fuels reduction project that we have in our area that's 4 years in, and we're still waiting for the environmental to be done. And that would have been a fairly simple solution. Again, we're not taking over the regulatory responsibility, but providing them with the legwork, the folks, boots on the ground to get the work done.
Yeah, obviously while you're waiting on permitting, you're dealing with the potential of a pretty expensive wildfire. And for some reason, wildfires don't wait on NEPA permits.
They do not.
When they actually go through.
We've seen that repeatedly.
Let me ask just a couple of clarifications. I brought up in my opening statement as well about power and power lines and sparking red flag fire warnings and what we deal with at times. anything that you have seen that has been effective for reducing the number of wildfires caused by power lines without actually just shutting down all power to communities as well?
Yeah, well, and as you know, I mean, oftentimes wind. So if you have another type of storm, it can cause that. And I mean, some of the mitigation measures that you use for hurricanes or tornadoes or straight line winds, you know, here in the east are effective for preventing this from happening. The problem is you know, we've mitigated a lot of these things in the east because of the threat of hurricanes and tornadoes and things like that, but we haven't done that in the west.
Okay. Is it just a rule, or is it just a physical structure that's attached to the line?
I think it's just been more of a matter of the risk and the threat over time, and where most of the federal money has gone over the years. You know, most of the federal disaster money and mitigation money has gone to those other.
Yeah, a lot of those are not federal dollars. Those are local power companies and co-ops and others on that. It's just, is it, what I'm asking is the way they're managing the line, or is it a piece of hardware or something else that's missing or software that's missing to be able to manage it? Go ahead, someone knows.
Yeah, I can touch on what Utah's done on that. I think it's a collaboration effort with those power companies. In Utah, we have taken a stance of identifying where that risk is on those power lines, if it's a high, medium, or low risk, and then working with those agencies to mitigate that risk. Developing fire mitigation plans with those agencies of how they are going to manage the risk that they have around those lines is very important.
Okay, Mr. Fogerson.
Great question, sir. And in Nevada, we've taken a little more proactive response, kind of following the Utah lines, where we prioritize what zone that power line is in and the odds of it starting a fire. And then our power company has actually contracted local government fire departments to go out and do the pole grubbing and the clearing out the lines. And then the power company is working with the Public Utilities Commission of Nevada to replace the at-risk power poles. A lot of the infrastructure is old. And I think that speaks to what the GAO representative was talking about, was on the East Coast. More of that stuff's probably been more recently replaced because of a disaster. We just haven't had the disaster to cause that power pole to need to be replaced yet. So now they're going and replacing the poles. They're able to wrap the poles with special material that actually expands to absorb the heat. So that way we keep those lines in place when a fire does come through as well.
Okay, that's really helpful. Mr. Chairman, I would take up anyone that's here that's willing to be able to have a chainsaw in their backyard and be able to bring it on over to be able to help us, because we deal with these red cedars, as I mentioned before, which are explosive to us. They're a nice, pretty tree. They're terrible pollen in the springtime, and they're terrible for being a fire problem for us, and they're an invasive species. It's one of the areas that we've got to deal with on mitigation. I know where we're clearing forests and trying to be able to manage underbrush and things that are there. We have the same issue in some of our open prairie areas as well, and we'll have to be able to work through processes to be able to resolve that in the days ahead. So thank you to all of you.
Very good, Senator Langford. And I appreciate you warning us on explosive trees in Oklahoma. So
I got my chainsaw ready.
Bring your chainsaw. We'll take some of them down and have fewer explosions.
Ready for duty.
sounds great. Senator Rosen, you're recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Chair Peters. I want to build just on this last question about Senator Langford brought up about shutting down the power lines, and thank you, Chief Fogerson. I just want to say that for shutting down power lines in a place like Nevada, that we regularly have temperatures greater than 100 degrees all throughout our state through a large portion of the year. This could create a second deadly consequence by them not having power. So it may not be, you know, it's just as bad. You could have a fire or high winds. We also get the Santa Anas. We get a lot of those winds coming in from the coast. And so do we want the power lines to go on fire? Do we want to kill people because there's no air conditioning? So this is why it's important that we talk about these things. But I'm going to talk about three main topics, one about smoke, one about land management. Like I said, 80% of Nevada's public lands, and then our wildfire designation upgrade, which I know is near and dear to the hearts of us in Nevada. So, you know, there really is a big impact of wildfire smoke on our air quality for our local communities. We're no stranger to that in Nevada. We experience hazardous air quality for weeks at a time. It forces small businesses to close their doors. Schools have to keep their students inside. It's got lots of health risks, and the smoke levels are just expected to increase more frequently as climate change causes more frequent and severe wildfires. So when smoke plagues communities like those in my state, we often don't have the tools to properly mitigate that, and that's really important. And persistent hazardous air quality as a result of wildfire smoke, it's not currently eligible for major disaster declaration under the Stafford Act, and it makes it difficult for us to get those federal funds. People really suffer, those with chronic lung disease. I remember being up there a few years ago, and I can just tell you, I couldn't breathe after a while. The sky is just brown from the smoke. And so, Chief Fogerson, can you talk about what happens, particularly up in northern Nevada, when that smoke just hangs over us coming in, and what it means if we could upgrade smoke as a major disaster declaration?
Thank you for the question, ma'am. You know, a few years ago, I think it was the rim fire was the first time that we actually saw this impact, because it hasn't happened. From my history in the fire service, I couldn't remember till the rim fire. And it just floated in and stuck around for a month. And then we had a year without it. And then it seems like every year now, every summer, we have 2 months worth of socked in smoke that's causing air quality issues. And I don't know if there's a good answer to it. There's a lot of people that have some thoughts on it, and we've had some jokes about it between the two of us as well on what some of these items are. But we got to figure out how we use good fire to reduce the number of fires that there are. So that way we have lighter smoke that it isn't as heavy and as dense and is in the right time of year for the air balances to occur. And then the other one is we got to start investing more in public health and sensors. So that way we can see where is the bad air quality at and do additional research on what the impacts of air quality is. Because one part of it is on not only on the community, but then we also have to think of our firefighters that are on the fire line in that smoke and then sleeping in a base camp in that smoke and then taking their 2-day break at home in that smoke.
They have the long-term health implications, and we know up in northern Nevada we have Lake Tahoe and all of the wildlife and other things in the community impacted that ecosystem as well. And so I think investing in research and development and how we address this is going to be good for everyone. I know that the commission recommended we invest in a national smoke monitoring and alert system, and you think that would be a good thing for us to invest in?
Yes, ma'am, I do, because when we look at it, urban areas have a lot of those smoke monitors. We look at rural and frontier areas, such as Nevada, such as Utah. We don't have many of those monitors, so it's harder to give people ideas of what is the air quality level and what precautions they should take.
Thank you. And I want to continue to talk about response and recovery. 80% of Nevada, land in Nevada managed by the federal government, 60% managed by the Bureau of Land Management. We have multiple federal agencies. It's kind of an alphabet soup. The Wildfire Commission reports that 5 federal land management agencies have missions related to wildfire management. All 5 of these agencies interact with you, with the tribes, with our communities. I'm going to stick on Nevada here. What are the challenges of having so many agencies, and what might you suggest to help streamline this process, particularly in this middle of a disaster?
Absolutely, ma'am. Part of the issue is trying to get the rules to be the same for each of the federal agencies. Each of the federal agencies, whether it's DOA, Department of Agriculture, or Department of Interior, they have different rules on how they do things. And so streamlining those, that way the rules are the same for the same federal agencies on how we use those firefighters and work rest ratios and all that stuff that National Wildfire Cooperators Group is starting to work pretty hard on, but there's still some nuances there. The agreements between local government and the different agencies is an issue. And then the bigger part of it is pulling in that emergency management, so that way we have the enterprise-wide approach. So that way we can bring in public works, we can bring in law enforcement, we bring in fire, we can bring in emergency management and have that coordinated collaboration like we do in emergency
and a
operations
central
center.
point of contact in the midst of the emergency would be most helpful to cut through some of these different bureaucracies. Would you say?
I would agree with you, ma'am.
Well, I'm going to move on to something that I know is really important to you and really important to all of us. We need to respect the wildfire, right? How do we do that? Well, we need to give it the same respect that we give the disaster of hurricanes. We need to be proactively ready to prepare. We see it coming. We know it's coming, but we can't wait till it crosses this particular road for you to do anything or some of the other groups to do anything. This is impacting our homes, our communities, our health, our ability to manage everything that happens. And so we have to do more to detect and respond, but moving that designation up to be like a hurricane, so we see it coming and we are there prepared and ready, what would this do to improve the outcome, saving lives, saving businesses, and just getting that damn fire out, right?
Absolutely. When we proactively use, the commission recommends a fire intelligence center or a fire environment center that is based upon NOAA and based upon just like a hurricane center. And then we move resources that way, then we can put those fires out before they get big, or have the resources there to utilize that fire in a beneficial manner because we have sufficient resources there to make that decision. And that's the whole crux of ensuring we have the right resource, the right place, at the right time, based upon what science today seems to be able to tell us through either AI modeling with our fire cameras, or the new sensors the Fire Administration put in Hawaii, or the weather data we're getting from NOAA.
And like I said, there's no longer just the western states. It's every state, and we need to respect the wildfire, and we need to prevent and attack it prevent it when we can, attack it when it's there, and work on mitigating it before and cleaning up after. So thank you. I thank you all for being here and everything you're doing. This is critical, critical work to every community across America. I hope we don't need to, I hope that all the mitigation prevention works so we aren't having to respond, but I'm grateful that you're thinking about the best ways to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Rosen. Senator Carper, recognized for your questions.
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks again for giving me a chance to talk a little bit about not just addressing the symptoms of problems and challenges, but also addressing the root causes. So now I've been to another hearing, now I'm back here. I want to ask a couple of questions. I want to ask a question I think, from Mr. Currie initially, involving how do we improve coordination between FEMA and local authorities, and after that I want to ask a question, Dr. Morell, how do we better support at-risk communities. So before I do that, let me just say that our planet's on fire. It's not just the western part of this country. Our planet's on fire. And NOAA tells us, National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration tells us that last year was the hottest year on the planet. Hottest in the year, as far as, way back as far as we can look, hottest year. They have a bicycle race in France the year before that, Tour de France. They had to just call off parts of the race because the pavement was melting on the race. So it's not it's not just incidental to the western part of this country. It's not just sea level rise on the eastern seaboard and other places. It's a real, and as we try to address the symptoms of these challenges, and that's important. It's also important that we continue to focus on root causes. So, of course, Mr. Currie, if I could, with respect to improving coordination between FEMA and local authorities, the evidence is, we think, is pretty clear. The threat of wildfire is escalating at a rapid pace and posing significant risks to the health and safety of communities, not just out west, but across our country. Wildfires are not only more frequent, they are also more destructive than ever before and more likely to burn hotter because of climate change. Extreme and persistent drought create drier fuel for those fires, and its accumulation over years creates the conditions that lead to high temperature firestorms that are extremely dangerous and move fast. The result is more loss of life and more loss of property. The FEMA plays a critical role in assisting state and local authorities in reducing the risks to our environment, our infrastructure, and our public health. And the GAO, Government Accountability Office, has conducted audits in recent years looking into the federal government's role in wildfire management. Question for you, Mr. Currie. Through the various audits and reviews that GAO has conducted, how can the federal government better improve its coordination with state and local authorities? I put my old recovering governor hat on. How can we better coordinate with state and local authorities to more productively address the impact and risk of wildfires?
Thank you, sir. Senator Rosen laid this out really well. I think what we need to do with wildfires is we need to treat them or prepare for them and respond to them the same way we do for hurricanes. And I'll just use a Delaware analogy.
I love it when our witnesses do this. We'll get more time for your testimonies.
So if we expect a hurricane to landfall in Delaware, we also declare an emergency. We don't just declare an emergency in Delaware. We declare an emergency in Maryland, Virginia, and maybe even a couple states north or south of that, because they're unpredictable. We know it's going to be bad, and we just go ahead and assume that's going to happen so we can take all the necessary steps to do that. I think the extent to which, that's not how it works in wildfire. We sort of wait and hope it doesn't happen. We hope it doesn't cross from federal or rural land into a populated area. That's just got to change. That mentality and whatever sort of rules and legislation are potentially behind that needs to change. The other thing we can do to improve coordination, I think FEMA particularly has gotten pretty good in terms of coordination with state and local on response. Recovery programs are the challenge. All these recovery programs across the 30 different agencies of the federal government that provide some type of assistance, they were never designed to work together for recovery. So like Senator Langford said with the permitting, they all have different rules, requirements, timeframes, and they're not designed to work in concert together. And so what happens is at the state and local level, that's just a very, very frustrating process in the years of recovery after.
All right, thank you for that. I noticed some of your colleagues up there nodding their heads and trying to wish they had a Delaware example they could offer as well. Dr. Morell, if you could, I already telegraphed my pitch, but question with respect to supporting at-risk communities. And fire departments in Delaware and across our country are depending more and more, as you know, on federal assistance to effectively respond to wildfires as the threat level has increased over time. As my colleagues on this committee have heard me say more than a few times, we got to find out what works. We got to do more of that. And what specific measures are the U.S. Fire Administration and FEMA taking to ensure timely and adequate support for at-risk communities, particularly in terms of health care and infrastructure resources? And also, how can we build on successful efforts to keep up with the increasing threat level of these devastating wildfires?
Thank you for the question, sir. Yes, USFA is certainly leaning into our communities and particularly their vulnerability to wildfires. We've noted throughout the hearing today the impacts of climate change, which you've brought up already, the various impacts. We've looked at the vulnerabilities of our land areas and where we're building communities toward fire-prone geographies. And so this continues to escalate our risk. We have to lean into, and where USFA was leading, to advocate for building codes that are based on science. We're advocating for technology to be able to be introduced. We're advocating for more and more complete data, quality data that can be leveraged to help us understand the fire risk index, not just in the wild land space, but once a fire hits communities, we have no idea today the dynamic nature of that fire. And so, yes, we can equate it to hurricanes, and we should elevate it to that recognition level. But what we cannot do, like a hurricane, there is no cone for a fire. So we can look at the cone on hurricanes, we can prepare for evacuation. In fire, we do not have that. So there is one caveat. Evacuating communities is very dynamic. And this is a challenge that I will say to you, we are leaning in heavily on wildfire evacuation, how we're going to prepare communities to understand. Right now, we use a ready, set, go. Well, ready and set should be already happening, not in the midst of a fire. And so we have to understand that when we hit go, that's in the midst of a fire. If we have not leaned into preparing our people across the nation to be able to evacuate, then we're going to have issues like the Paradise Fire, where we had 85 people trapped on the egress route, like Lahaina, where it was so fast, the time for evacuation was minimized. And so there are dynamics of wildfire that do not match the hurricane model that I don't want to lose base. The other thing I'd say, Senator, is highlighting, as you have in our communities, the real effect of continuing structure fires. So it's not always a wildfire that starts with vegetation. We have structure to structure spread that happened in Lahaina that becomes conflagrations in our communities, but also we have already lost in homes where people should be their safest. Almost 600 people since January 1 have died in their homes. That doesn't mean all of the people who've been displaced. This is from fire in general. You said America's burning. I'm going to echo that. America is burning, and we need to be attentive to all methods of fire that is bringing that about.
Mr. Chairman, could I have maybe another minute? Thanks very much. Yesterday, Democrats, senators gathered to hold our annual caucus retreat. Issues it was just a wonderful time to share ideas and what's working, what's not. Republicans had a similar kind of caucus, I believe, yesterday. And one of the things I mentioned to my colleagues yesterday is about, in terms of what's actually causing this, the root causes behind these, our planet on fire. About 30% of the greenhouse gas emissions in this country are coming from our mobile sources, our cars, trucks, and vans that we drive. And probably another 25% comes from power plants that generate our electricity, coal-fired plants, natural gas-fired plants. And maybe another 20% comes from manufacturing operations, think asphalt plants, think steel mills. Those are the three majors, 30%. 25%, 20. That's like 3/4 of the root causes, and it contributes to this problem. We're working on all of those as a country. We're working on a lot of those and trying to provide maybe some inspiration for provide leadership for the rest of the world. So I just want to know that we're not just addressing the symptoms of those problems, which are tragic, but we're also going after the root causes, and we're all in this together. So thank you very, very much.
If I may, sir, on the greenhouse gases, wildfires themselves produce greenhouse gases that then contribute to climate change or are causing the drought that help perpetuate wildfires. So this becomes a very circular in nature problem. So thank you for recognizing that.
Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah. Thank you, Senator Carper. Mr. Currie, the GAO has issued a number of reports on the federal government's emergency management efforts on wildfires, on topics ranging from federal cooperation to manage growing risk, to barriers to recruiting, to retaining federal wildland firefighters, many others. So my question for you is, what are some of GAO's top recommendations for FEMA to better help communities prepare for, manage, and respond to wildfires? What should the committee know, and what can we do?
A couple things. First of all, back in 2019, we issued a report on wildfire response, and we actually identified some of the things we're talking about today and how unique the response was and how FEMA programs weren't necessarily geared towards that. FEMA developed a plan in response to some of our recommendations to try to change some of their programs to better gear themselves towards wildfire. There was some progress there. There just was not enough. And a great example is the housing one I talked about. So FEMA provides short-term housing when the federal government responds to a disaster like a wildfire. This is not really designed for the length of recovery for a wildfire that a survivor has to deal with. And there's not really a good option in that intermediate phase, which is what we're seeing right now in Lahaina and trying to find places for disaster survivors to live. So, we've made recommendations related to housing. I talked about the debris removal challenges, how they're so much different than hurricanes. But one of the biggest things that needs to be done is reform of the recovery process and the recovery programs. Because again, what we hear from the state and local level over and over again is that the programs were not designed to work together, and that leads to delays and oftentimes missed opportunities in disaster recovery.
Thank you. As we wrap up here, I'm going to have just a question, Mr. Fogerson and Ms. Andreani, if you would address this. And this deals with the Wildland Fire Mitigation and Management Commission report, which we mentioned had some 150 recommendations, so an awful lot to think about. But I'm going to ask both of you to prioritize some of those in your mind. There wasn't a prioritization in the report, but what things stand out for you? I'll do, Mr. Fogerson, you can start, and then give us some idea as to what we should be looking at. If we're drafting legislation, what should we be focused on?
Great question, Senator, and I'm sorry I don't have a good answer for you, because it is such a wicked problem that's why there's 148 recommendations we made. It would be hard, and I would be remiss to tell you the top 3, the top 5, the top 10. I guess
the top 11 then.
I would be looking at the themes that we have in the report, the chapters, and maybe seeing how we do legislation in each of those various chapters and grouping those things together, because one really has a nexus to another. We've got a great chart that commission staff made for us, and I'm sure we can share with your staff that shows how interconnected all the recommendations are. So if you pick 3, then that eliminates a few other ones. So I would really highlight that staff looks at the chapters and sees about using that as their priority base rather than the recommendations.
Well, that's a good guide. Senator Andreani, do you have top 10 list or top 5 or 3?
Well, I would concur with David that, they're all important. Excuse me, sorry. However, I did point to a couple in my testimony that I think are, lack of a better term, fairly straightforward opportunities that can dramatically change outcomes in communities. And so I would ask you to consider those, because I think they're policy level, some may, level opportunities to right-size, the problem and address some very immediate issues that we have, so.
Okay, very good. In the interest of time, we're going to wrap up, but Dr. Morell, I'm going to be submitting a question for the record for FEMA to kind of identify for us which recommendations FEMA is implementing on its own from the commission and which recommendations you believe require congressional action specifically. So I will be submitting that for the record and would look forward to seeing your response to that. So I'd like to first just thank all of our witnesses for joining us here today to share your testimony and expertise. This is an important conversation and one that does not end today. We've got a lot of work to do, including a lot of recommendations to act on, but also support the men and women who are dealing with this issue each and every day and oftentimes risking their lives to do that. Congress and the entire federal government must do its part to address this increasing threat, and we must do everything we can to create resilient communities in the process. And I look forward to our continuing work together to improve both mitigation, preparedness, response, as well as recovery capabilities. The record for this hearing will remain open for 15 days until 5 p.m. on March 29th of 2024 for the submission of statements and questions for the record. Thank you again. This hearing is now adjourned.